Okay, so let's jump right in. So many of the core institutions we just take for granted today have these deep and kind of hidden roots. In this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers and look at the surprising architects behind some of the foundational pillars of the West.
Really think about it for a second. We see hospitals and universities everywhere. They're fundamental parts of our society. But they had to come from somewhere, right? Who first had the wild idea to create an entire building just for sick people, or a permanent home for learning?
Well, the answer might surprise you. According to the historical sources we're digging into, the blueprints for these concepts, and a lot more, were drafted by a revolutionary movement that began to reshape the world from the inside out, the early Christian church.
Let's start with one of the biggest shifts, the very idea of how we care for one another. And this wasn't some slow evolution. It was a complete, top-to-bottom revolution in social thinking.
So before Christianity, the Greco-Roman world had the system of public giving called euergetism. Basically, a rich guy would build a new public bath or fund a citywide festival. It was a transaction, really. The gift was for everyone, not just the needy. And the whole point was to gain honor and status.
And here's what we see: a massive contrast. Christian charity just completely flipped the script. It wasn't about gaining status by giving to the whole city. It was a religious duty to specifically seek out and help the most vulnerable: the widow, the orphan, the sick. This focus actually created, for the first time, a specific social group called the poor, who was seen as uniquely deserving of help.
This idea was so radical, it actually needed a brand new word, philoptochos, which is Greek for lover of the poor. This wasn't philanthropy like the Romans knew it. This was an active, compassionate drive to care for the destitute. And according to our sources, that was an entirely new idea in the classical world.
And this wasn't just some abstract philosophy. No, it led to the creation of institutions that had never existed before. The nosocomiae were the direct ancestors of our modern hospitals. Alongside them, you get orphanages, homes for abandoned babies, and shelters for the poor and travelers. These were the very first seeds of institutional social welfare.
Historian Gary Ferngren puts it perfectly. This shift from gaining civic honor to showing personal compassion wasn't just a small tweak. He says it was one of the truly revolutionary changes in human sentiment in Western history. It was a fundamental rewiring of how people felt, with consequences that would echo for centuries.
Okay, so that's social welfare. Now let's see how that same revolutionary spirit applied to a totally different area: education. As one empire was crumbling, a new kind of institution became the unlikely guardian of knowledge.
Think about it. Rome falls and the public schools disappear. Literacy rates just plummet. But in these scattered monasteries across Europe, you had monks who were meticulously copying and preserving every text they could find, and not just religious ones, but classical works of science, math, and philosophy.
And Saint Benedict was central to this whole thing. Around 528 AD, he made valuing books and learning a core part of the monastic mission. That's why historian Daniel Boorstin called him the godfather of libraries. He basically institutionalized the idea of saving knowledge. And you can trace a direct line from there. It starts with the monasteries preserving books. Then, in the 8th century, the Emperor Charlemagne orders all monasteries and cathedrals to open schools. And what grows out of those very schools? Well, around the year 1200, places like the University of Paris emerge, and boom, the modern university is born.
And here again, you see this revolutionary social shift. Roman education was typically for elite boys only. But the early Christian aim, as radical as it sounds, was universal education. The historian W.M. Ramsey notes that it made no distinction of sex, which was pretty much unheard of at the time.
All right, our third point might seem a little counterintuitive. It's the relationship between faith and science. I know the common story is one of conflict, but the sources we're looking at suggest that early Christian theology actually provided the logical framework for science to even get started.
And the logic here is really interesting. The thinking went something like this: if God is a rational being, then the universe he created must also be rational and operate according to reliable laws. Now, this was a huge departure from worldviews that saw nature as chaotic or ruled by the whims of unpredictable gods. So, if the world is ordered, then studying it wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of reverence, a way to understand the mind of the Creator by looking at his creation.
The sociologist of religion, Rodney Stark, puts it bluntly. He says Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. Not just helpful, essential. This conviction that the universe was lawful and knowable gave investigators the confidence they needed to believe there were real, discoverable laws out there to find.
Finally, let's look at the most complex topic here: how these new ideas began to change the perception of human value, which eventually set society on the long and painful trajectory toward ending slavery.
And we have to be really clear here. The ancient world, including the world of early Christians, was built on slavery. It was a brutal, unquestioned reality. As the historian Peter Brown writes, its grim logic was like a vast ice cap on society. Christians owned slaves, and the church itself owned slaves. That's the hard truth.
But then, over many, many centuries, something began to change. A new moral logic started chipping away at that ice cap. The idea of universal human dignity and worth, which came out of their theology, created this unsolvable tension with slavery. And that tension would eventually lead to moments of liberation, like the one this statute commemorates.
That tension eventually led to official condemnations. This declaration from Pope Paul III in 1537, though tragically late and often ignored, was a key turning point. It's an official statement from the highest level of the church, saying that the enslavement of peoples is fundamentally wrong.
Now here's the nuanced but really critical point from the source material. While the history is deeply complicated, the sources argue that the theological idea that slavery itself was a moral evil, a sin that had to be abolished entirely from society, was a unique development that grew out of Christian thought. And this provided the moral firepower for the abolitionist movements that would finally end the practice in the West.
So when you pull all these different threads together, you can actually start to see the outlines of our modern world taking shape from these ancient ideas.
We've inherited a specific idea of charity that led to social welfare. We have universities because monasteries first saved the books. We have science built on a theological belief in a lawful universe. And we live in a world that was shaped by a moral revolution that redefined human worth.
You see, these aren't just historical footnotes. They're the invisible foundation supporting so many of our most cherished institutions and values. And it leaves us with one final fascinating question to think about. If these architects had used a different blueprint, what would our world look like today?